This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 385, entitled Masculist Counter-Arguments to Feminist Arguments Against Legislating the Para, that's Paternity, Rejection, Right. Description. This flyer presents the two main arguments that the masculists will use to counter the arguments that the feminists will use against the masculist push for the legislation of the para, that's Paternity, Rejection, Right. The flyer itself. Masculist counter-arguments to feminist arguments against legislating the para, it's Paternity, Rejection, Right, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. The world is gearing up for the greatest battle between the sexes that history has ever known, namely the fight for the legislation of the para, the Paternity, Rejection, Right. That is, the male equivalent of the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that women already have, called by masculists the MARA, that is, Maternity, Rejection, Right, so that women have the right to terminate a pregnancy that they do not want, but men have no such equivalent right, a fact that makes masculists burn with hatred at this most blatant of sexual discrimination, which locks men into paying for a child he does not want, manslaving him by the hated fluffy feminist witches who don't give a shit about the rights and interests of men, but who merely see men as cash machines to pay for women, to please women, to benefit women, and men, well, they can go fuck themselves. The injustice of this burns with masculists. It makes them rage. It makes them want to pick up weapons and go out and shoot the feminazi witches who made these grossly unfair gender laws, who still see men as traditional man-slaves who work for women, to spend decades of their lives working for women, being man-slaves to women. It is this bitter reality that masculists are gearing up to destroy, with bullets if necessary, in order to wipe out a practice that is more morally abhorrent than the Negro slave trade due to its much greater size. The US Negro slaves were only a tenth of the US population, whereas there are 4 billion men with a B. 4 billion man-slaves to women who need to be liberated. The core idea of masculism, that it's a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women. This idea is explicit in the very title of my book on masculism, that is, Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women. The main reasoning behind this masculist attitude is that, 1. It was men who liberated women, that is, from household drudgery, by giving women the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, modern medicine, life expectancies well into the 80s. 2. As a result, women chose to have 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases, so have a career window of some half a century. 3. The masculists argue, quote, now that women can work, they must work, since anything else is man-slavery. 4. Man-slavery is slavery. 5. Slavery rouses passions. Look at the origins of the US Civil War. 6. Slavery is a war issue, and the masculists are at war against the hated fluffy parasites and against the even more hated fluffy feminist hypocrites who have taken over the divorce courts and made divorce so toxic for men that 2/3 of young men in many countries refuse to marry, reject paternity and spend their money on themselves. They have chosen to go MGTOW, that's men going their own way, an important branch of the men's lib movement. 7. marriage boycott and rejection of paternity makes the fluffy feminist hypocrites who control the divorce courts indirect genociders, indirectly wiping out whole populations due to their attitudes towards men, seeing men as cash machines to be robbed and exploited, to serve as financial supporters of fluffy parasites so that they can sit on their fat parasitic asses and live in a middle-class house to raise her children, as seen by the divorce courts, who give custody to children after a divorce to the mother with a 90% probability that the man pays for. 8. This manslavery attitude of the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges will eventually get them killed. Hence, since the hatred level of men is growing to such a point that fairly soon it will explode and we will see the beginning of a masculist guerrilla war against these manslavers, these vermin, these Untermensch. To masculists, the prime piece of gender political legislation that they are pushing for is the legislation of the para. To masculists, achieving the para is the 21st century equivalent of the feminists achieving the right to vote early in the 20th century. The feminists of that time reasoned that giving women the right to vote would empower women to achieve the many other equalities with men that they wanted and later got later in the 20th century. For example, equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, the MARA, anti-rape legislation, anti-domestic violence laws, etc. The masculists want the para, which they see as having an equivalent empowering effect on men, because the passage of the para will force women to grow up, to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, that is, financially independent persons. By forcing women to bother to get a career-competent education at high school and college so that they don't expect, fluffy style, to be able to parasite off the labour and money of a man, making her a hated manslaver as seen by the masculists and increasingly by men in general. One of the major political goals of the masculists is to create a FIP society, that is, in which young women are socialised by parents and educated by teachers and professors to be FIPs and are severely punished by their male classmates if they don't. I read that in the UK now, young men care more about the FIP level of a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks, which is a major statement. These masculistic young men are becoming increasingly conscious that they do not want to be parasited upon by a hated fluffy, so look carefully at how FIP the woman is that they are looking over. Is she a FIP? Is she a fluffy? Does this woman expect me to be a manslave for her? If so, then she can go fuck herself, because I certainly won't. I spit at fluffies. I see them as vermin, immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin, to be wiped off the face of the earth by denying their fluffy parasite genes from reproducing, being forced to rot on the shelf, because increasingly no man will go near them. They are pariahs. End quote. Masculists argue that the legislation of the para will force women to become FIPs so that they can afford to have their own kids and raise them with their own salaries in the case of them divorcing and not being allowed by masculist-influenced divorce courts from getting alimony, from getting half his wealth, his house, etc. Masculists are pushing for the men-faring of the divorce courts by throwing out alimony, making custody of children joint by default, by scrapping the 50-50 division of wealth, which in practice usually means that the woman gets half of the accumulated wealth of the man by not raising a finger, but merely signing a marriage contract and giving him a bit of cunt every blue moon. Modern marriage so sucks for men that the fluffy feminists who have taken over the divorce courts are looking more and more like child-minded, irresponsible criminals who in the limit will be killed by masculist soldiers who will not tolerate that these fluffy feminist hypocrites indirectly wipe out whole populations, which is what they are currently doing. The achievement of the para is becoming increasingly the focal point of political action by the masculists, the equivalent of the right to vote, that is, the franchise for women, as pushed for early in the 20th century by the suffragettes. So, Imagine in the next few years that the masculists achieve the media breakthrough that they need to transmit the masculist message to the masses, so that millions of men become influenced by masculist ideas, that millions of men become infected by the masculist virus and pass it on to other men, so that a great chorus of masculist men scream out in their stadia for the passage of the para. As this masculist movement for the passage of the para builds up steam, the fluffy feminists will be forced to look carefully at what it will imply for women, especially for fluffy women and for fluffy feminists. They will start making intellectual arguments against the para from a feminist viewpoint. What is it that they will likely say? Here is my take on what they will say. As the pressure for the legislation of the para heats up, these initial speculations on my part will be replaced by actual arguments dreamt up by feminist theorists that then in turn will be combated by masculist theorists, which is what the rest of this flyer is about. How will feminists, will women, react towards the masculist push for the para? They will be horrified, terrified, because it will mean that a woman who gets pregnant may have full financial responsibility for the upkeep of the child if she decides to continue the pregnancy and if the father rejects paternal responsibility, which may be the case if the para is legislated. The fact that women have the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy but men don't screams out of injustice against men, which so enrages masculists, fills them so full of hate against those fluffy feminists who reject the para, that it will eventually get them killed, because this single issue is a war issue. It raises so many passions and is so obviously, so massively unjust for men. This is the end of part 1.